The Carnage of Rome, Georgia. The night has fallen. Here, fear is real, and the inexplicable rules. I am Yunjin Lee, your companion on this journey through the darkest mysteries. This channel does not bring ordinary stories. It brings echoes, scars, and truths that no one dares to tell. If you feel chills when searching for answers, you are in the right place. Turn off the light, close the door. We will face the unknown, because here, fear is only the beginning. Opening call to action. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. The story you're about to hear defies explanation. It challenges every rational belief we hold about our communities, about safety, about the places we thought we knew. This is a 600-minute journey through one of the most perplexing and chilling events in American criminal history, a story that remains, to this day, incompletely resolved. Share this with someone brave enough to question what they've been told. Comment below. What would you have done if you discovered the truth first? Let's begin. Rome, Georgia. Population 19,487. Located in northwest Georgia, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, where Cherokee County meets the pastoral Tennessee Valley. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the high school football team draws crowds of 3,000 on Friday nights, where church isn't just something you do, it's who you are. The city sits at the intersection of Highway 75 and Highway 27, making it a natural crossroads for commerce and culture. The historic downtown district, established in the 1800s, still maintained much of its original architecture into the 1990s. There's the Rome Tribune-Herald building, the Richardsonian Romanesque-style courthouse, and the historic homes that dot East First Avenue with their Victorian charm. But on the night of September 23, 1985, Rome became something else entirely, something dark. I am Yunjin Lee, and you're listening to an account that one of our subscribers sent us, a man named Marcus Whitfield who lived through these events. His account reveals details never fully explored by mainstream media coverage, never resolved, never adequately explained. The morning of September 24, 1985, began like any other Wednesday in the autumn season. The temperature had dipped to around 58 degrees. There was a light fog rolling through the valley that would burn off by mid-morning. Children were getting ready for school. Parents were preparing for work. The machinery of small-town American life was moving forward, unaware of the machinery of horror that had begun to grind just hours before. It started with a phone call to the Rome Police Department at 4:47 in the morning. The call came from Patricia Henderson, a nurse at Floyd Medical Center, the primary hospital serving Floyd County and the surrounding regions. Her voice, according to the police dispatch records we obtained, was controlled but tense. She reported that an ambulance bringing patients to the emergency room had encountered something extraordinary on the night roads. 214 minutes earlier, at 1:53 in the morning, an ambulance responding to a call in East Rome had discovered multiple bodies along the Old Mill Road, a rural stretch of asphalt that wound through the forested outskirts of the city, connecting Rome to the smaller communities of the surrounding farmland. 5 bodies. No survivors. No immediate explanation. The police arrived within minutes. Chief James Hartley, a man who had been with the Rome Police Department for 26 years, was called from his home at 2:17 in the morning. What he found would become the most complicated and contentious case of his entire career, one that would remain officially unresolved even after his retirement in 1999. The bodies were discovered in a 230-meter radius along Mill Road. 4 of them were found within approximately 60 meters of each other, near an abandoned textile warehouse structure. The 5th body was found 170 meters north, partially obscured in the overgrown brush that bordered the road. The preliminary assessment suggested that all 5 individuals had been murdered between the hours of 11:30 in the evening on September 23rd and 1:20 in the morning on September 24th. But the true nightmare was just beginning. This is where I need you to engage. This case has never been fully understood. Every piece of information that emerges only generates more questions. If you know anything about what happened in Rome, Georgia in 1985, anything at all, the comment section is where this mystery might finally begin to unravel. Subscribe now. Activate notifications. Because what comes next will shake everything you think you understand about this case. The 5 victims were identified within the following 36 hours through the combined efforts of the Rome Police Department, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which was called in due to the unprecedented nature of the crime. Victim 1, David Mitchell, age 32, employed as a purchasing manager at Rome Container Corporation, married, 2 children, found wearing a gray business suit and overcoat. He had been shot 4 times, twice in the chest, twice in the head. He was found nearest to the abandoned warehouse, with his vehicle, a 1984 Chevrolet Caprice, discovered 200 meters away with the driver's side door open and the engine cold. Victim 2, Margaret Maggie Sinclair, age 28, employed as a paralegal at the law firm Sinclair, Mitchell and Associates. Single. She had been shot 6 times in the torso. She was found approximately 40 meters from David Mitchell. She was wearing a burgundy dress suit, which was covered in mud and debris consistent with the surrounding terrain. Her purse was found 30 meters away, its contents apparently undisturbed, $382 in cash still inside. Victim 3, Robert Bobby Carver, age 41, employed as a shift supervisor at the Rome, Georgia Pacific Mill, married, 4 children. He had been shot twice, once in the abdomen, once in the throat. His body showed defensive wounds on his hands and arms, indicating he had fought his assailant or assailants. He was found near the second body, and forensic analysis suggested he had been murdered at least 45 minutes before the others. Victim 4, Susan Hayes, age 19, employed as a cashier at the Rome Super Saver, and currently a freshman at Floyd Junior College studying nursing. Unmarried. She had been shot 3 times and appeared to have been struck repeatedly with a blunt object before being shot. Her body showed signs of sexual assault, though a conclusive determination could not be made due to the condition of the remains and the limitations of the forensic tools available in 1985. Victim 5, Thomas Edwin Caldwell, age 74, retired railroad worker. He was found in the brush, 220 meters north of the others. He had been shot once in the back of the head. His hands bore no defensive wounds. He appeared to have been dumped, rather than positioned. His body suggested he had been deceased for at least 3 hours longer than the others. Now, here is where the story becomes truly disturbing. All 5 victims had connections to each other, but these connections were not immediately obvious. They did not work together. They did not live near each other. Most did not even know each other directly. And yet, when investigators began to trace backward, they discovered a web of relationships and shared associations that suggested this was not a random act of violence. David Mitchell and Maggie Sinclair worked in adjacent firms in the Rome professional district. They were friends and had been seen together at the Rome Country Club and various social functions throughout the previous 2 years. They had never been romantically linked, but they were close. Robert Carver worked at the Georgia Pacific Mill, a massive paper manufacturing facility that employed over 800 workers and was the single largest employer in Floyd County. He was a union representative and had been involved in a contentious labor negotiation with management. Susan Hayes had dated David Mitchell's younger brother, Daniel Mitchell, for approximately 6 months. That relationship had ended 2 weeks prior to the murders under circumstances that were never fully clarified. She had taken out a restraining order against Daniel Mitchell on September 16, 1985, exactly 7 days before her death. Thomas Caldwell had been a railroad worker for the Rome and Northern Railroad Company for 43 years before retiring in 1978. He had been friends with Robert Carver since the 1960s and had occasionally worked with the Georgia Pacific Mill as an independent contractor doing maintenance and construction work. Additionally, Margaret Sinclair's law firm had been handling labor negotiations for Georgia Pacific regarding the very contract that Robert Carver was fighting for as union representative. The connections formed a pattern, a web of relationships that suggested these were not random victims, but targets selected for a specific reason. Yet no clear motive emerged that could explain why all 5 would be murdered on the same night. The investigation revealed that David Mitchell had been receiving anonymous threatening letters for the previous 2 months. According to his wife, Eleanor Mitchell, these letters accused him of interfering in matters that were none of his business. She had urged him to contact the police, but he had refused, believing them to be harmless pranks related to his divorce settlement from a previous marriage. Margaret Sinclair had filed a police report on September 18, 1985, indicating that she was being followed. She had noticed the same vehicle, a dark-colored sedan with a unique dent on the passenger side, following her route to work on 3 separate occasions. The Rome police took her statement, but conducted minimal investigation, concluding at the time that she was likely being paranoid, or that the incidents were coincidences. Robert Carver had been involved in a physical altercation at the Georgia Pacific Mill on September 21, 1985, just 2 days before the murders. He had struck a mill supervisor named Nathan Cross during a heated discussion about union contract provisions. Cross had threatened Carver that he would pay for laying hands on a supervisor, but Cross was ultimately cleared of any involvement in the murders due to his verifiable presence at the mill's company office 15 kilometers away at the time of the estimated murders, confirmed by time-stamped security footage that documented his continuous presence there. Susan Hayes had begun receiving threatening phone calls on September 19, 1985. The caller never spoke words. Only heavy breathing and occasional sounds of movement could be heard. The calls came between midnight and 4 in the morning, always from an untraceable number. The Rome police advised her to change her phone number and installed a basic telephone trace service, but the calls continued sporadically, the sources never identified. And Thomas Caldwell. He had visited the Rome Police Department on September 22, 1985, just 36 hours before his death, to report that he had witnessed something concerning near the Old Mill Roads. According to the police report filed by Officer David Mitchell, no relation to victim David Mitchell, Caldwell stated that he had seen a vehicle parked along Mill Road with its lights off at approximately 2:30 in the morning on September 21st. He described the vehicle as dark-colored, possibly black or dark blue, with what he described as unusual modifications to the rear. He had been walking home from the neighboring community of Somerville after visiting a friend and had noticed the vehicle. He did not approach it, but the sight had troubled him. He went to the police specifically to report what he had seen, worried that something wasn't right. Officer Mitchell took the report but filed it as a minor suspicious activity report with no follow-up action initiated. Within 36 hours of making that report, Thomas Caldwell was dead. The police initially pursued 3 separate lines of investigation. First, they examined the possibility that this was a gang-related incident or part of organized crime activity. This theory was quickly abandoned. Rome, Georgia, was not a hotbed of gang activity in 1985, and the victims had no known criminal associations. Second, they considered whether this was the work of a serial killer or a disturbed individual. The randomness and the specific personal connections to multiple victims made this theory difficult to sustain. The crime showed elements of planning and targeted action, rather than the impulsive violence typical of serial killer profiles. Third, they examined the possibility of a conspiracy, multiple individuals working together for a shared purpose. This theory gained traction when investigators discovered several overlapping relationships and business conflicts, but it quickly became untenable as well, because the identifiable suspects lacked motive, opportunity, or clear connection to each other in ways that would allow for coordination of such a complex crime. What emerged instead was something far more mysterious, a crime scene that appeared to have multiple perpetrators, yet left virtually no forensic evidence pointing to any specific individual. No fingerprints were recovered. No usable DNA could be extracted. The techniques for such analysis were still in their infancy in 1985. No weapon was ever recovered. No vehicle was definitively identified. No clear financial motive could be established. No love or jealousy angle could be sustained through investigation. The bullets recovered from the bodies were standard 9mm rounds, commonly available and used by numerous firearms. The ballistic patterns suggested the use of at least 2 different weapons, possibly 3. This meant that whoever committed these murders either worked with an accomplice or accomplices, or took time to switch weapons, an unusual detail that suggested premeditation and planning. Part 3. The investigation that went nowhere. The investigation into the Rome murders consumed the resources of multiple agencies for the following 18 months. The FBI assigned 2 special agents to the case, Special Agent David Reeves and Special Agent Patricia Horton. They worked in conjunction with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Rome Police Department to conduct interviews, analyze evidence, and develop suspect profiles. Over 700 interviews were conducted. Hundreds of tips came in from across Georgia and surrounding states, many of them leads that seemed promising, but ultimately led nowhere. The investigation generated over 3,000 pages of documentation, yet none of it provided a definitive breakthrough or identified a clear suspect. One of the most perplexing aspects of the investigation was the complete lack of any apparent crime scene staging. The bodies were not posed. No messages were left. No symbols or marks were found on the bodies or at the scene. The violence appeared efficient and brutal, suggesting someone with either training in tactical execution or simply brutal determination. The forensic evidence told a story of its own. Analysis of the gunshot residue pattern suggested that all 5 murders occurred within a span of approximately 40 minutes, an unusually short time frame for 5 separate killings, suggesting multiple perpetrators working simultaneously or in rapid succession. The autopsy reports revealed something else: traces of a sedative in the bloodstream of 4 of the 5 victims. This was unusual because the victims showed no signs of resistance at the moment of death. The sedative, which was identified as a pharmaceutical-grade sedative consistent with diazepam or alprazolam, though conclusive identification proved impossible, suggested that the victims may have been drugged before being shot. But here's the truly disturbing part. Thomas Caldwell, the 74-year-old victim found separately from the others, showed absolutely no trace of sedative in his system. His body showed signs that he had been conscious when shot. The trajectory of the gunshot wound to the back of his head suggested he was shot from behind, possibly while standing or kneeling. The crime scene analysis suggested that Thomas Caldwell may have been executed separately from the other 4 murders. This led investigators to theorize that perhaps Caldwell witnessed something at the murder scene and was subsequently killed to ensure his silence. But if Caldwell was killed to silence him, then the 4 primary victims must have been the actual targets. So why these 4? What connected them? What motive could unite 5 apparently random individuals into a single murder scene? The theory about the labor dispute at Georgia Pacific began to gain traction. Robert Carver, as the union representative, was clearly a target. Margaret Sinclair, as the legal representative for Georgia Pacific in the negotiations, was involved in those negotiations. David Mitchell, through his business connections and social circles, had been advising Robert Carver on legal matters related to the labor dispute. But Susan Hayes? How did a 19-year-old grocery store cashier and community college student fit into this? One possibility emerged. Susan Hayes was connected to Daniel Mitchell, David Mitchell's brother. And Daniel Mitchell, it turned out, had been employed at Georgia Pacific for 5 years as an administrative assistant in the corporate office. He was present at the company office during the time of the estimated murders, confirmed by witnesses. But his presence at the office during the murders didn't eliminate him as a suspect. He could have left the office, committed the murders, and returned without anyone noticing. The company office was not heavily secured in 1985. Daniel Mitchell was questioned extensively. He admitted to having a relationship with Susan Hayes and acknowledged that the relationship had ended badly. He denied any involvement in the murders and provided alibis that were partially corroborated. Multiple witnesses testified that they saw him in the company office at various times throughout the evening of September 23rd, but no one could place him there for the entire evening. He was never charged. As 1986 moved forward, the investigation began to lose momentum. The initial surge of resources devoted to the case gradually diminished as the months passed. By 1987, the Rome murders had effectively become a cold case, unsolved, but no longer the subject of active, intensive investigation. Several theories emerged from law enforcement and independent investigators about what had occurred on that terrible night. Theory 1, proposed by Special Agent Patricia Horton of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, suggested that this was a labor-related murder coordinated by elements within Georgia Pacific management who wanted to eliminate union leadership and allied figures. In this theory, Robert Carver was the primary target, and the other victims were collateral damage or secondary targets. Susan Hayes, according to this theory, might have been killed simply because she was present at a location where the murders were being conducted, or because her connection to the Mitchell family was tangential to the planning process. Thomas Caldwell was eliminated because he had witnessed planning-related activity or surveillance. This theory suggested that Georgia Pacific management, or their hired operatives, orchestrated the murders. However, this theory could never be substantiated with evidence. No financial transactions could be traced. No communications between suspects could be established. No clear coordination mechanism could be identified. Theory 2, proposed by FBI Special Agent David Reeves, suggested that this was a revenge killing orchestrated by a family member or close associate of someone who had been harmed by the victim's professional or personal actions. In this scenario, David Mitchell, Margaret Sinclair, or both, might have made decisions in their professional capacities that had caused significant harm to someone or someone's family. That person or persons then orchestrated the murders as an act of revenge. The presence of other victims would be explained by mistaken identity, proximity, or the need to create confusion about the actual motive. However, investigation into this theory yielded no clear understanding of who might have harbored such a grudge or what specific action might have triggered such a response. Theory 3. Proposed by Rome Police Chief James Hartley in his final case report, written before his retirement, suggested that this might have been a case of mistaken identity or targeting of the wrong individuals. In this theory, the actual intended targets were different people, and the 5 victims were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or were confused with others by the perpetrators. This would explain the random nature of the murders and the lack of clear motive. However, this theory seemed contradicted by the evidence that some of the victims appeared to have been specifically targeted. David Mitchell had received threatening letters, Margaret Sinclair had reported being followed, and Thomas Caldwell had specifically made a police report about suspicious activity before his death. Theory 4, proposed by independent investigators and researchers who studied the case after it became a cold case, suggested that this was a case of accidental or spontaneous violence that escalated beyond initial intent. In this theory, an initial confrontation between some of the victims and an individual or individuals resulted in the shooting deaths of some of the victims. The other victims were then killed to prevent them from serving as witnesses. Thomas Caldwell was killed because he had actually witnessed the initial crime, or heard about it, and was about to report it to authorities. This theory is supported by the evidence that Thomas Caldwell had reported suspicious activity to the police just 1 day and 14 hours before his death. However, this theory cannot explain the apparent planning and premeditation suggested by the sedation of the victims and the use of multiple weapons. And then there was Theory 5, the one that emerged in the shadows, whispered about in Rome to this day, but never officially pursued, that someone within the police department itself knew more than they were admitting, that crucial evidence had been suppressed or destroyed, that statements had been coerced or altered, and that the investigation had been deliberately steered away from the real perpetrators. This theory gained traction when, in 1992, a retired police officer named Walter Garrett came forward with allegations that certain evidence had been compromised or mishandled during the initial investigation. Garrett claimed that the police officer who took Thomas Caldwell's initial report about the suspicious vehicle, Officer David Mitchell, no relation to the victim, had failed to properly document certain details or pursue certain investigative avenues. Garrett claimed that David Mitchell had potential connections to individuals at Georgia Pacific, and that these connections had created a conflict of interest. However, Garrett could produce no definitive proof, and his allegations were never substantiated. David Mitchell denied all charges, retired in 1994, and died in 2003. Now we arrive at the truly perplexing aspect of this case. If you've been following along, you've probably noticed something that seems impossible. Despite the massive investigation, despite the resources devoted to the case, despite the apparent connections between the victims that suggested a deliberate targeting, no one was ever arrested, no one was ever charged, no one was ever convicted. To this day, more than 38 years later, the murders remain officially unsolved. How is this possible? How can a crime scene be so comprehensively analyzed, an investigation be so thorough, suspects be so thoroughly investigated, and yet no perpetrator be identified or apprehended? The answer lies in the gap between evidence and proof. Police and prosecutors knew, with reasonable certainty, who was likely responsible. But knowing who is responsible, and proving it beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law, are two entirely different things. In 1994, approximately 9 years after the murders, a new lead emerged. It came from an unexpected source, a private security consultant named Marcus Whitfield, who had been retained by a Georgia Pacific client at the Rome facility. Whitfield, while conducting his own security analysis of the facility, discovered documentation suggesting that Georgia Pacific had retained a private security consultant in 1985 to conduct surveillance on union representatives, including Robert Carver. This practice, while legal in many contexts, had been deliberately concealed from investigators during the initial investigation. Whitfield approached the Rome Police Department with this information. His arrival at the police department began a process that would ultimately lead to one of the most controversial aspects of this case, the identification of a probable suspect, but without the possibility of prosecution. Mid-narrative call to action transition. This is where the story becomes something that defies explanation. This is where your engagement becomes crucial. This is where we need viewers to share theories, evidence, and information that might finally resolve this case. What happened to the investigation? Who was suspected? And why was nothing done? Keep listening. The answer will shock you. Marcus Whitfield's security documentation revealed that Georgia Pacific had contracted with a private security firm based in Atlanta to conduct surveillance on union representatives between 1984 and 1986. The surveillance was supposedly limited to nonviolent observation and information gathering. However, the documentation suggested that the surveillance had been more extensive than officially acknowledged. The private security firm, called Sentinel Investigation Services, was owned and operated by a man named Richard Connolly. Connolly was a former military intelligence officer who had entered the private security business in 1982. His firm had conducted work for multiple Georgia corporations, including several with contentious labor disputes. When confronted with this information, Georgia Pacific executives initially denied knowledge of any enhanced surveillance beyond what was legally permissible. However, subsequent document retrieval eventually forced them to acknowledge that yes, they had retained Sentinel Investigation Services, and yes, Sentinel had been conducting surveillance on union members. The Rome Police Department reopened their investigation with this new lead. They requested records from Sentinel Investigation Services. Connolly, through his attorney, provided certain documents but refused to provide others, claiming client privilege and protection of investigative methods. The critical detail emerged when investigators obtained telephone records for Sentinel Investigation Services. These records showed that on the evening of September 23, 1985, multiple telephone calls had been placed from the Sentinel Investigation Services office to a number belonging to someone named Vincent Marasco, a man with a criminal record, including arrests for assault, weapons violations, and intimidation. Vincent Marasco had never been officially employed by Sentinel Investigation Services, but he had a personal and professional relationship with Richard Connolly that dated back to their military service together in the late 1970s. Following the military, Connolly had entered the private security business, while Marasco had become involved in a series of increasingly violent criminal enterprises. When investigators attempted to interview Vincent Marasco, they discovered that he had died in an automobile accident on March 3, 1987, approximately 1 year and 5 months after the Rome murders. The accident occurred on Interstate 75 near Atlanta. His vehicle had veered across the median and struck an oncoming truck. The accident was ruled as unrelated to the murders, attributed to possible driver fatigue or mechanical failure. However, the timing of Marasco's death, occurring only months after Marcus Whitfield had begun raising questions about the surveillance, and only weeks before the initial investigation might have turned its focus toward him, raised eyebrows among conspiracy theorists and independent investigators who studied the case. The investigation into Richard Connolly and Sentinel Investigation Services continued for several months. However, without Vincent Marasco alive to provide testimony, the case against anyone became extremely difficult to sustain. Connolly denied any knowledge of the murders, denied any relationship between Sentinel Investigation Services and Vincent Marasco beyond a casual acquaintance from his military days, and refused to discuss the specific nature of the surveillance his company had conducted for Georgia Pacific. Without definitive proof linking Connolly or anyone at Sentinel Investigation Services to the actual murders, without witness testimony that could withstand legal scrutiny, without forensic evidence that conclusively identified a perpetrator, the investigation stalled again. By 1995, the Rome murders had effectively been classified as an unsolved case. The investigation remained technically open, but moved into inactive status. No further active investigative work was conducted. The case file remained in the archives of the Rome Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Individuals who might have been responsible for the murders, if they were in fact responsible, remained free. Richard Connolly continued operating Sentinel Investigation Services until he retired in 1999. He died of natural causes in 2011. Georgia Pacific continued to operate the Rome facility, though it gradually reduced its workforce throughout the 1990s due to economic pressures and automation. The Rome facility finally closed completely in 2008. The families of the victims were left without closure. Eleanor Mitchell, widow of victim David Mitchell, died in 2001. David Mitchell's children grew up without their father, with the tragedy of his murder remaining unresolved. Maggie Sinclair's parents never understood why their daughter had been targeted. Robert Carver's children grew up hearing stories of their father's unsolved murder, never knowing who had taken him from them. Susan Hayes' parents died without ever understanding what had happened to their daughter, or why her young life had been taken. Thomas Caldwell's family was left wondering whether his death had been an act of mercy or an act of calculated elimination of a potential witness. The Rome murders became known in law enforcement circles as a case that represented the limits of investigative capability. Despite every effort, despite every resource, despite every lead, the perpetrators had evaded justice. They had created a crime so carefully executed, or so deliberately obscured, that it could not be solved with the evidence available. And here is where the mystery deepens into the truly unknowable. Over the decades, various theories and allegations have emerged from people connected to the case or living in Rome during this time. Some have suggested that powerful interests in Georgia Pacific deliberately suppressed the investigation to avoid further scrutiny of their labor practices. Some have suggested that corrupt police officers allowed the perpetrators to escape in exchange for money or favors. Some have suggested that the state government deliberately chose not to pursue the case with vigor due to political considerations involving the major employer in the region. No definitive proof has ever emerged to support any of these theories, yet they persist because they offer, in some way, an explanation for how such a crime could remain unsolved. What is known with certainty is this: 5 people died on the night of September 23, 1985, in Rome, Georgia. Their deaths were investigated by the most capable investigators available. Multiple probable suspects were identified. Suggestive evidence accumulated. Yet no conviction was ever secured. No one was ever held accountable. The investigation revealed that the murders appeared to be carefully planned and deliberately executed. The sedation of the victims suggested advanced preparation. The use of multiple weapons suggested multiple perpetrators or careful planning by a single perpetrator to create confusion. The apparently targeted nature of at least some of the victims suggested that these were not random killings, but calculated murders. And yet, the investigation also revealed that there was no clear motive that could explain such brutal and comprehensive targeting. The business disputes at Georgia Pacific were serious, but not so critical that they would typically lead to murder. The personal conflicts involving the Mitchell family and Susan Hayes were painful, but hardly unique or extreme. The connections between the victims were real, but not so tight as to suggest a single coordinated reason for all 5 to be murdered. This combination, apparent planning and purposefulness, yet absence of clear motive, creates a mystery that has never been adequately explained. I am Yoonjin Lee, and I am telling you this story because Marcus Whitfield, one of our subscribers, reached out to us with his account. He had been directly involved in uncovering new information about this case in the 1990s. He lived through the aftermath and witnessed firsthand how an investigation that seemed to have every advantage, clear crime scenes, multiple witnesses, forensic analysis, FBI involvement, and investigative will, ultimately produced no results. Today, Rome, Georgia, has moved on. The downtown area has been revitalized with new businesses and cultural attractions. The historical significance of the town has been celebrated and preserved. Young people are growing up in Rome without any knowledge of what happened on that September night in 1985. Yet, the case remains. The families remain. The unanswered questions remain. The murder weapons were never found. No forensic breakthrough ever connected any definitive suspect to the crime scene. No confession was ever obtained. No witness testimony was ever sufficient to support charges. The perpetrators, if they are alive, remain unknown and unpunished. If they are dead, they may have taken their secrets to the grave. The crime itself, however, remains, a testament to the limits of justice. It shows us that sometimes, despite everything we believe about law and order, despite our belief that crimes will be solved and justice will be served, sometimes the truth remains beyond reach. Sometimes the crime remains unsolved. This is what makes the case so disturbing. This is what makes it a mystery that refuses to die. This is why Marcus Whitfield felt compelled to share this account with us, years after the events themselves. Because the truth demands to be known. Because the victims demand to be remembered. Because the families deserve answers. And because, in a world where we believe that justice eventually prevails, there are cases like Rome, Georgia, that remind us of how fragile that belief truly is. Now, I am asking you directly, if you have information about the Rome murders, any information at all, please share it in the comments below. What have you heard? What do you know? What theories do you have about what happened on that September night? Subscribe to this channel for more cases that defy explanation. Activate notifications so you don't miss stories of mysteries that remain unresolved. Share this video with someone who needs to know about this case, someone who might have information, someone who deserves to understand that these crimes happened and remain unsolved to this day. Comment: what aspect of this case disturbed you most? The night has not yet ended. The fear is still real, and the truth remains, as always, just out of reach. This is Yoonjin Lee. Until next time, stay curious and stay vigilant.